Do you ever sit down with another educator and think, I could just listen to them speak for hours? That's exactly how I feel about today's guest. I had the chance to talk to Georgina Rivera about ways that we can support multilingual learners in math and how we can shed light on the brilliance that every single child in the classroom has within them. If you don't yet know who Georgina is, she is currently the principal of a school in Connecticut, but before that, she was a math teacher, a coach, and a STEM supervisor. She is active in many professional organizations, including NCSM, where she served as the vice president. One of the things I absolutely love about Georgina is just how practical the tips and the strategies that she provides are. I think you'll find yourself reaching for a pen and paper to jot down all of the ideas that she shares in today's episode. Georgina, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I feel grateful to be here with you today.
One of the things that, just from hearing your story and, just being a consumer of some of your work, I know that you grew up being a multilingual learner in the classroom. I would love to just hear kind of what that experience was like for you and how that really impacted the work you do today.
Coming into a classroom and being a multilingual learner, I think for myself, what I remember is probably not feeling that sense of belonging is probably one of those big things. Like if I was to put a word on it today, it's belonging. I was really seeking representation within my teachers. I was seeking representation within the tasks I was doing. And so much of the way school was back then was not really focused on like tasks that were culturally responsive or connected to myself or not even my classmates. I mean, I couldn't have been the only one feeling this way. And so many times when I would be faced with different word problems or a lot of math vocabulary, it'd be completely overwhelming because I didn't have the background knowledge. And so if you asked me back then, was I a math person? I would have said absolutely not. Like if it was just naked numbers, I could do the math. But when it came to geometry or problem solving, it was very difficult for me because I had to grapple with so much language. And we didn't really attend to language as math in math classrooms. I mean, it was kind of like an afterthought. Maybe a teacher might have had a word wall, but I don't really even remember that. And so I think for myself, like my why is I wanted to be the teacher I always needed. I tell that story all the time. Like I needed someone to see me for the math that I knew. I needed somebody to see that I was willing to learn, and I just needed someone to see my strengths. So that's like really the why behind the work. And like when I think about my teaching, I'm always reflecting or my leading because I'm trying to always attend to what students need instead of like centering what I need.
Yeah, I love that. One of the things I read an article that that you were involved in writing, and one of the things that you said in there is you said that the things that we do to support our multilingual learners are things that are truly supporting all learners, and I love that perspective. So I'd love to hear from you because I know for myself in my own training prior to being a teacher, I was not given a lot of tools or strategies for supporting our multilingual learners in the classroom. And so I would love to know if there are any like practices or teaching strategies that you found to be really effective in supporting those students in the classroom.
Sure. So I'll try to name some really practical things because I feel like people really like practical things. So
Yeah.
For example, having a visual word wall is good for all kids because we know that math is a language. And so even though I was a multilingual learner, I say all students are math language learners because math has its own set of vocabulary. And so if as a classroom teacher, you can have a very intentional word wall that is student generated. So students could you could write the word, but students create the images and they come up with the definitions once they have used it several times. And then having that up and making it interactive where you're doing activities with that word wall would help everybody in the room because there are very complicated words in math that everybody grapples with. But if I'm a multilingual learner, I'm going to grapple even more just because I probably haven't heard the word at all. So that's like one thing. The second thing is, we learn about talk moves for student discourse all the time. Well, talk moves are very effective when working with multilingual learners because think about it, like I get to hear the repetition. I could add on a little bit without being completely overwhelmed. I could rephrase something using my own home language. That gives me an opportunity to be able to talk in my L1. And then one of the things that's really important is giving like that turn and talk and that pause before we actually share. So like one of the things I remember doing in my math classroom is anytime I asked a question, we would always, the kids would have like a partner talk before we shared out. And what I was doing is I was kind of eavesdropping and listening to like who was going to share. But if I purposely sought out like different ideas, but I would also listen. If a multilingual learner had an idea, I would say to them, okay, you're going to say that. What help do you need to be able to say that out loud so everybody knows that you know what you're talking about? And so like that small move, and that would help everybody. Like I'm prepping you to say, Brittany, I'm going to call on you. Are you ready to share this out? Let's hear what it would sound like. So when the share out comes, not only do you feel good about sharing your answer, you've already kind of prepped it. So that's a second thing that I think is super helpful. And then I know people talk about it a lot, but when we're dealing with word problems, what we should be doing is doing a lot of sense making. A lot of teachers jump to like solving the problem, but using things like the math language routines. My favorite is the 3 reads strategy, and really making sense of a problem helps every student. So like those are just 3 specific examples, but all of those would help enhance anybody in the room, because it just gives them, like for example with the 3 reads, 3 opportunities to make sense of it, 3 opportunities to hear it, and then if you add like a visual or an image up there, if I don't have background knowledge, now I do, because that picture might help to make sense of the problem. So that's why I'm so passionate about this, because I feel like all students would benefit from this no matter what. If we ask teachers, where do students struggle the most? Math language, problem solving, besides fact fluency. So I just feel like if we were to use those strategies, and it drives me a little bit crazy that we put it as an afterthought in a textbook or a curriculum, but I'm like, no, that routine is good for everybody. Right. And if we trained our teachers to use that all the time, then we would just be enhancing our instruction. So that's just a small summary of how passionate I feel about this, because I just feel like it helps.
Yeah, for sure. No, I love those because those were so incredibly practical. I love what you said in the first tip where you said all students are math language learners. I was like, that was just like a light bulb moment for me. I absolutely love that. In working with some of the teachers that I've worked with, I love all of these strategies because they are good for all students. I don't know if you have a large population of multilingual learners at your school, and one of the struggles that teachers are facing is they feel like they're not able to accurately like reveal what students know about math when it comes time for assessments. And so I don't know if you have any ideas or anything that you do at your school for assessments. Is there a way to support these students when it comes time to, okay, we've got to do a district assessment or an end of grade assessment, and we need them to be able to kind of like show what they know about math on their own when maybe the assessment isn't necessarily set up for them to see success in that?
That's definitely a work in progress. At my last school, we had a lot of multilingual learners, and at my current school. So some teachers have started to translate their exit tickets into a home language because there are strong translation apps. The other thing is, if you're in the upper grades, like 3, 4, 5, Google Extension has something called Google Read and Write, but as part of that, there's a translation feature. Oh, wow. So if it was actually in Google Classroom, then that could read it to them in their home language. Oh, wow. Or, for example, like we use, I don't want to name companies, but we use math programs that have sometimes like individualized learning paths. They don't have every language, but they've added one language. So my teachers have already like turned on that language for the kids who need it. So I think what's happening is technology can maybe help to leverage some of this work, especially with AI. Like as I'm seeing the emergence of AI, I'm wondering how many of these Google Extension apps or AI could possibly help take these problems and read it to students so then they can actually show what they learn. So like a really good example I have right now is we just received a girl from the Middle East who doesn't speak any English at all, and she's plowing through this math program because she knows a lot of math in her home language, like tons of
Yeah.
it. And so she's just learning the American phrases or the English phrases that go along with the math that she already knows. So that is helping her tremendously. And a lot of it is we're using technology to take those problems and put them into translation apps to be able to help. So that's one. A second way is if you have anybody in your building that speaks more than one language. So at my previous school, we used to do interviews, as you know, for kindergarten and first graders. That's the way we assess a lot of times, or we'll watch them. If we have anybody that speaks their home language, we're actually trying to do, at my old school, we did interviews in their home language as long as we had an adult there and say, hey, can you help me real quick? Can you ask them this question in Spanish or Portuguese or whatever the home language is? I have a lot of Spanish speaking students and Portuguese speaking students. So we'll ask them, and it's incredible how much they know. So I think it's really leveraging resources within our building and seeing who actually knows the language. What technologies can we leverage to be able to maybe translate some of this stuff? And then the final thing is, even if they don't fully understand the language, sometimes we'll read it in English to them. So it takes the reading piece out of it. We'll read it to them so they can hear it, and then allow them to answer with pictures or just numbers. Sometimes we ask for a written response, I know in math, but like for them, we're just like, show whatever you know. So really like allowing them to use their voice. And I say voice could be visuals, it could be diagrams, it could be just numbers, to be able to see like what they actually know. What we're finding out is that they know a lot. But unless we're leveraging some of these ideas and thinking outside the box, then we're not going to get there. So I guess my short answer to this is it's an emerging area for us, but I do think technology is probably one of those untapped areas that's going to help us tremendously in this area if we think like openly about this.
Yeah, that I love that. So I was in a classroom with a teacher just a few weeks ago, and I think she had like 4 or 5 different languages in her that were spoken in that one class, and she only spoke English, and so that was really challenging. And it was one of the situations where I was like, I was working with small groups, and I was like, I don't even know in this situation really how to support these students, because I'm sure, based on kind of like what I'd seen, like I'm sure that they understand it, but we there was that barrier of communication to like really just push them, like they were just making like one small mistake, and to really like just help them understand where they were, where their misstep was. And so I think about the fact that I'm like, oh, I had my phone on me. It was not even like a consideration for me to pull out and use technology in that way to support that group of students. So I love that. That's such a practical tip, but it's one that, there's so much hate around AI right now, but that's a really great tool to be able to reach all students. So I love that.
And we push that out through just to give teachers a tip, like the Google Read and Write, we push that extension out onto every Chromebook for that reason, because people said, well, who should get it and who shouldn't? I said, well, let's not guess and check here. Let's just put it all out there, because there's students also with reading disabilities that can't be able to do that. And I wanted to add on to something you say, because I think you said something super important. When you have multilingual learners, small group instruction is really where they thrive, because they can have the manipulatives like right in front of them. You can see in real time what they're writing. You can provide tools for them. So I do think that's a really great way to assess what they know. I would say, some people are like, well, what type of instruction? Really good math instruction, when we start with the concrete, is exactly what they need in a small group. I remember being lost in a large group lesson because I was like, this is a lot of directions. But in a small group, you can really hone in. Even if they don't all speak the same language, you can see in real time. So I love, Brittany, that idea of really recommending small group for them.
Yeah, that's another great idea. And I think it's something that a lot of teachers are already doing, but seeing that as a way to really support all learners, because all learners really thrive in that setting as well. I absolutely love that. And so you've talked about it several times, is you've said that when you were working with students and they were in their home language, you were like, oh my goodness, they they are brilliant. They know so much. And that was a big aha moment for me when you came and spoke to our teachers at the math experience, is you talked about the difference between IQ and brilliance. Can you just share a bit more about, what the difference is between those two things?
I read a book that talked about student brilliance that I really loved, and it really resonated with me because so much of what we use to measure intelligence is something called IQ. And so there's, like, as you know, IQ testing, and many of it is normed, but it's not normed for multilingual learners. It also is not, the assessment questions also don't cater to multilingual learners. So if I don't have the background knowledge or the language, I'm not going to come out with a high IQ necessarily, because the assessment doesn't really account for that, right? Just like state assessments. I really struggle with that when they're forced to take state assessments and we haven't made the accommodation for multilingual learners, like having, high level like AI or translation apps to be able to translate that. But brilliance is the opposite. Everyone has brilliance, and it shows up when you're in your area of passion. So, and I'm sure teacher has seen this, when a student is doing something that truly they're so good at and they shine and they're joyful, that's brilliance. And so brilliance is something that every child has, no matter what. And it's also cultivated when you use strengths-based practices and a growth mindset. So we really try to focus on strengths-based practices and what kids know and grow them from what they know. And when we give assessments, we try to, I'm working with some of my teachers on marking what's right and leaving what's wrong alone, and then being able to do some reteaching and then having them go back and fix their work. So it's that idea of reversing, that idea of things are wrong or you don't know, versus, no, we're going to work on this until you do know it. And so that cultivates their brilliance. I think one very important thing is that they're all brilliant in math. It's just a matter of, are we spending the time to cultivate their math identity? Are we using good practice to be able to help them to understand things well? Are we going at the pace that they need? Because, every child learns at a different pace. And are we finding tasks that are engaging, that connect with their background knowledge? I've seen students who necessarily might not call themselves a math person, but then you hit them with the right task and they're all over it. So I'm like, wait a minute, you were brilliant the whole time. So I really attach on to brilliance because it's something that we all possess. It's something that can be cultivated, and it's something that is asset focused and strengths focused. And I think that's what the world needs. IQ testing is the opposite. It says 2% of the population is brilliant. Only certain people are smart. Then they group them into these tracks. And then once you get in there, no one else can get in. It's a lot of gatekeeping. So I really struggle with IQ. Not to say that certain people don't have exceptional abilities in certain things, right?
Yeah.
But that we could rename that brilliance, and then could move away from that idea of IQ. I just think it's a lot, and it causes a lot of division. We don't need more division in schools. We don't need division in society. We need for all of us to lean into our strengths and brilliance so we could have a strong classroom community. So that's why I'm so passionate about brilliance, because I see it every single day. It just shows up in different ways for different kids.
Yeah. Do you have any ideas or strategies or things that you've done? I know you kind of started to touch on it, but things that you've done to really, I think, reveal brilliance, because I think it's easy for us as educators to maybe overlook that, there are certain students who are struggling, overlook the fact that they do have that brilliance within them. So how do we, reveal that in a way? But then also, I think there are a lot of students who would not describe themselves as brilliant. They are the student that says, I'm not a math person. Brilliance and math is not something that goes together to them in their math story. And so do you have any just strategies that you have seen implemented in your school or that you've implemented yourself to really reveal that brilliance both to the teacher and the student?
First, you can only find brilliance if you take the time to get to know your students. So you have to really spend the time to get to know them as people. What are their interests? What are their passions? What is their family like? What is their culture? So really understanding them first and who they are. So that way you're selecting things that are going to excite them. So that's like step one. So if I knew that you really loved mathematics and you loved working with, I don't know, 10 frames or whatever it is, like I would have to make sure that I incorporate that at some point into my instruction. So getting to know kids and what they get excited about, like even having a day, I remember in my middle school class, it sounds silly, but I had a day where we would put out all the different manipulatives and everybody would pick like their favorite one and why. And it was so interesting because then I would find experts. I'm like, they would just know how to put things together and they knew a lot about them. So it was just ways for me to get to know them in a playful way that was very low stakes. So that's step one, like get to know your kids. Then step two is look for ways to highlight when they do things right. So I worked with a very talented third grade teacher. Her name is Leah Barron. And so what she did was she created this a really simple thing, a binder, and it had a picture of all of her students and their names, and it would say mathematician spotlight. And she would purposely look for like, them doing something great. And at the end of a lesson, she would turn the page and then highlight the mathematician that was being spotlighted. And the kids got so excited about that.
Aww.
And it doesn't take almost any work. If you could picture a 3-ring binder with plastic sleeves and all of their pictures are in there. And it would be like, today Brittany had a really great model for this, array. And this is the way she designed it. And look at her multiplication sentence and all of this. And, she would talk about how they would be. And she was intentional about making sure that she kept track that at some point in the month, everybody got highlighted at least once. So I think it would elevate each of them because they saw each member of the class. So that's one way. A second way is we created badges, and I have some at my school right now where we basically call them math coaches. So we would create them, these little badges, and it would say math coach. And on the back, it would have like these questions they could ask. They couldn't give answers, but they would say things like, where are you stuck? What is your next step? What have you done so far? And so we would just give them the questions a math coach would ask. And it was great because kids would finish early so they could be like, here's my work. Could I be the coach for the day? So we're like, okay, yeah, you got it. You can go around and help. And yeah, and it was so funny that, and then they would go home and tell their parents, I was a math coach. I'm like, think about that. Like, that is so great for their brilliance. And so at some point during a lesson or a unit, there's going to be something that hits for a kid. It might be, during the geometry time or like we're working on fractions and they really know how to, I don't know, find equivalent fractions, whatever it is that we're working on, and then they become the resident expert. So those two moves were big things, either spotlighting or making them coaches. And basically you're elevating their brilliance in that moment, and you're bringing it to the attention of the whole community, and you're also kind of affecting what we say is their identity, which then activates their agency. And when their agency is activated, that's when brilliance is like at its best. Because now it's like, I'm showing you what I know. I mean, when we did this for the first time, I was like, I couldn't believe it. They were running like number talks. I'm like, you're in third grade, but they just were so, I had just a second grader create a splat, a Steve Wyborny, he has the splat. She created the splat at home. She made the whole thing and ran it for her class. Excuse me.
I love that.
I was like, there you go. Brilliance at its finest. Math coach extraordinaire. And then I tell the teachers, I'm like, why are you making materials? Please, please.
Right.
So that's how we reveal brilliance, is like doing things where we activate their agency and help them to like be the center.
So one of the things that I studied when I was getting my master's was essentially how students' belief about themselves as learners in math impacts how they see themselves as learners just in general. Because I think that when people, go into math and they feel like, oh, like I'm dumb because I can't do math, I think that carries with them into other classes. And so to see that students are having this experience, that they are just have such pride in their ability and their leadership and all of that, I just think that is so cool. And it would be so interesting to see how that impacts how they show up in other learning situations in their life. So I absolutely love that. One of the things that I saw a snippet of a session that you did in 2021, I think it was for the NCTM like virtual conference that they did, and you talked about being a warm demander. And I would love for you to just kind of share a little bit about what that is, because I think that that ties into cultivating or revealing students' brilliance in the classroom. So what is that warm demander?
Okay, so the original phrase, because I like to give people credit, came out of Lisa Kleinfeld, and she was working with children in an Eskimo population, and she really looked at how they showed up at school and how they could be seen. And what she noticed is that the teachers that had the most success with those students had high levels of care and high expectations. So warm meaning I really care about you and I know who you are as a person, and demander means I have high expectations. And so I'm very passionate. It was funny, like the first time I heard that word, it came from, I tell this story, my superintendent said, I just read an article about a warm demander. You're a warm demander. And then she hit send. And I'm like, I don't know if I should be offended or not, because I'm like, warm
Right.
is nice, but demander is kind of bossy, right? So I was like,
Yeah.
okay. So then when I did the research on it, I was like, oh no, this is a good thing, right? So,
Yeah.
and that did really kind of embody who I was. I didn't really intentionally seek out to do that, but I wanted kids to feel loved and cared for in my classroom, and they knew that they could come to me for everything. But at the same time, I didn't lower expectations. Like I knew what the standards were for my grade level. I would work really hard to make sure they got there. I would seek out people that would help me because I didn't have all the answers, but my team did, or my ESOL teacher did, or special ed. And I basically convinced them that they were all brilliant. And because they came in, I was a seventh grade math teacher, they came in sometimes with a very low math identity. So I was like, whoa, I got to really work hard here to build connections and then get small wins. So that's how I kind of focus on being a warm demander, is like getting them the small wins so then they could start to see themselves as math people. And then always making sure that as I give them tasks, they're leaning into their interests to set them up for success, and then scaffold as needed. So don't scaffold ahead of time, but scaffold as needed. And by the end of the year, they just become like they just tell everybody, I'm a mathematician now. They just feel like that's their strength area, but that takes a lot of care and it takes a lot of high expectations, because they knew like failure was not something that was going to be tolerated. If you were to think about your favorite teacher, Brittany, I'm sure that person was a warm demander. They probably really knew you and they cared about you, and they also had high expectations for you. And I find that to be true of almost anyone that I speak to. We just don't always use that phrase warm demander, but we should, because that's what we need to cultivate in each and every one of our teachers. If we're just warm and we have low expectations, that's not helpful. Like I had teachers like that. I didn't need low expectations. What I needed was people to have high expectations and help me get to that highest level.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I think that the warm demander, like, I think having those high expectations communicates like a certain level of confidence in students. When we say, like, I have these
Mm-hmm.
expectations and I'm not lowering them for you because I believe you can do it. Like that, I think, especially for students who maybe lack that confidence, I think
Mm-hmm.
like that confidence in the students kind of contagious. And it reminds me, so I've been an athlete, my whole life. And so it makes me think about the coaches I've had, and the coaches that I've had, the ones who are just the demander side of things and have these expectations, but show no level of care. Those were not the coaches that I responded to, but the coaches, and there were very few of them, but the coaches who I could tell truly cared about me, they truly believed in me, and the high expectations were a result of the fact that they believed I could do it. Those are the coaches that, playing under them, that's where I thrived. And so I just love that warm demander. That's not something that I'd ever heard until I heard you talk about it. And so I just love that, because I think it's too not opposing, because I wouldn't say that caring and having high expectations are opposing. In fact, I think that when you do care, you have those high expectations. But I think together it is just such a wonderful reflection of how we should show up for students in the classroom. So I appreciate you kind of exposing me to that term, because I just love it.
It's one of my favorite words. I love the whole phrase. So I appreciate you even asking about it because it's like one of my favorite things.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so I could truly talk to you forever. We talked for quite a bit before we even hopped on camera, but
Mhm.
I would love to hear from you. You have just the work that you've done, and when you came and spoke to our teachers, and hopefully one of these days I'll get to see you speak in person. But
Mhm.
your work and your insight has really impacted me, and so I would love to hear from you. What is is there an educator or a researcher or a book that has just really impacted your beliefs and the way that you show up in math education?
Let me just start with I think when I started my math journey, if I was just talking about like the pedagogy of math, I think one thing that helped to open up my eyes about how math should be taught, because I wasn't really taught math in a way that really made sense, was the Van der Waal book. And I
Mm-hmm.
know it's an older book, but it really showed me how to use manipulatives to be able to teach math in a way that was visual, because I don't feel like I was taught math that way. So I know it's an older book, but it really helped to shape my thinking around number one, what should I be using? What do students need to be able to understand this? What are some of the misconceptions that might come up? There was just so much in that book early on that I was like, wow, I didn't even know all this stuff existed. Like I knew there were manipulatives, but what do I do with all this stuff?
Yeah.
So that was a kind of like my go-to book. Like I would start a new unit of study and I hadn't started my master's program and I would like go through the Van der Waal book and I was like, okay, let's see what he's using. So that would be one of the places that definitely I think impacted. The other, I think, big thing that really impacted me was learning about culturally responsive instruction and what does that actually mean to have number one, high expectations, to include kids' culture and really community, and then to look at math through a social justice lens.
Yeah.
There are several books that people have written about it. There's the newest one by Shelley Jones and Lou Matthews and Yolanda Parker that gives us some tasks to look at. But my professor, Shelley Jones, really introduced me to that concept. And I think it helped me to realize that we needed to spend time to get to know our students. Like I always knew that, Brittany, like as a person, because that's what I wanted. I think I told you early on, like I wanted to be seen. But that was the research of what really confirmed that for me, like that I wanted to be seen. And this is why, because culture is so important. It's ingrained into all we do, and math is ingrained into culture.
Yeah.
So, really looking at that was critical. And the final one I would say, just for myself, was the principles to actions, looking at the 8 teaching practices. I know it sounds silly, but just having those high leverage practices, because as practitioners we have so many to pick from. So then I'm like, okay, now I know what manipulatives to use. I know I need to include culture and identity. And now this last piece of like, okay, which practices are really the most important and how do I put these together? So those are really critical. So those would be the top ones I would say. I always reference visible learning for mathematics just because sometimes I'm like trying to choose things and I want to look at some other things, but those are like 3 of, I would say, the ones I had the most influence would be those 3 books. I read a lot of books, and what happens, I don't know if you feel this way, is after a while they start to confirm your thinking. So
Mm-hmm.
then I'm like,
Yeah.
oh yeah, that's what they were saying, but in a different way.
Yeah.
But those are just 3 of many. I mean, there's so many great ones, but those are just 3 that I just remember early on, like, wow, like they just kind of changed the way I thought about teaching.
Yeah. Yeah. All three really great books that you just recommended. And yes, I think it's important whenever we go into a learning experience. Like I always tell teachers, I'm like, you are either going to like learn something new or you're going to get the validation that you are like on the right track, you're doing great things, or you're going to get the reminder of like, oh, I know this is best practice, but I haven't actually been doing it. And so, yeah, I definitely am finding like as you read more, there is a lot of like, okay, like I'm on the right track here, or here's how I could like make this even a little bit more effective. So, yeah, such
Mhm.
fantastic books that you recommended. I know teachers will want to connect with you after this. So, is there like one place that I can send them to? I don't know if you're active on Twitter or Instagram. I would love to, send them your way, get them connected with you.
So just for like a personal contact, if they want to contact me, just with my email, I'm on LinkedIn for my
Okay.
professional profile. So there you can see the books that I've written, the conferences that I've presented at, and also my personal emails on LinkedIn. So if they're on LinkedIn, that's one way. The second way is I don't have a personal Instagram account, but I always welcome people to follow my school. We are at COIA_IB, so Charter Oak International Academy, COIA_IB, because we're an IB school. And there I'll share like some ideas. And then on Twitter, I'm at Math Coach Rivera. So that's my own personal one on Twitter. And I share some ideas there. So you can look through. I love to share best practices or follow great teachers, and I'll reshare things there. So those are the three main sites. So LinkedIn for my personal email. If you want to connect me, if you want to see what my school is doing, you can go to Instagram at COIA_IB, or I'm on Twitter at Math Coach Rivera, or I should say X, because I know it's not Twitter anymore.
I know. I feel so like outdated, or maybe I'm getting to that place where my grandparents are at, where I'm like, I refuse to call it X. It's still Twitter to me.
I know. I guess it's X. I don't even know. I was like, it changed in one day, and I was like, all right.
I know. Yeah, I have no idea. But yes, we will get all of that linked in the description. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm already planning to have you back, because there's so many other questions that I want to ask you, but I just appreciate your generosity with just your knowledge and your experience. And I cannot wait to talk math with you again soon.
I look forward to it, and I feel honored that you had me on. Grateful to all the listeners out there for listening, and I would love to connect with you. And I always say this, I'm also a learner, so if you have ideas to share with me, I would love to hear from all of you, because I think it's important that we're all sharing ideas all the time.
Oh yes, I'm sure people will take